Welcome, everyone, to Chapter 11, Defining and Assessing Learning. I want to open with a question that sounds simple, but turns out to be surprisingly deep. How do you actually know that someone has learned something? Picture yourself as a physical education teacher. Your students are serving better in tennis today than they were last week. Wonderful. But is that real learning, or did they just happen to have a good day? Or picture yourself as a physical therapist whose stroke patient just walked across the clinic unassisted for the first time. That's a beautiful moment. But will they be able to do it tomorrow and at home, not just here with you cheering them on? Here is the central concept of the whole chapter, and we'll keep returning to it. We can never observe learning directly. We can only ever infer it by watching performance during practice and on tests. That single idea, learning is invisible, so we have to deduce it, is what makes assessment genuinely tricky. And it's what this entire chapter is built to help you do well.
Here's our roadmap in 3 parts. In Part 1, we'll carefully separate 2 words that students often blur together: performance and learning. They are not the same thing, and the difference matters enormously for how you assess anyone. In Part 2, we'll look at the 6 general performance characteristics, the 6 observable signs that tell us learning is actually taking place. And in Part 3, we'll get practical about assessment, the methods researchers and practitioners use to measure learning, including performance curves and the all-important retention and transfer tests. We'll close with a warning, because practice performance can fool you in 2 specific ways. By the end of the hour, you should be able to define learning properly, name the 6 signs that it's happening, and pick the right test to prove it, whether you're working with a student, an athlete, or a patient. Keep that practical goal in mind. Everything here eventually answers the question, how would I show my supervisor that real learning occurred?
Let's begin Part 1, which tackles the foundational distinction the whole chapter rests on: performance versus learning. I framed it as 2 everyday questions, one from a teacher, one from a therapist, and that's deliberate because this is anything but abstract. The moment you try to grade a student or decide a patient is ready to go home, you run straight into it. Over the next few slides, we'll define both terms carefully, see why learning can only ever be inferred, and meet the sneaky factors that can make performance lie to you. Let's start by actually sitting in those 2 practitioners' chairs. Let's begin Part 1 with the problem that motivates everything else. I gave you 2 scenarios on this slide, and I want you to actually sit in each chair for a moment. First, the physical educator teaching the tennis serve. Your students look better today, but how do you know that improvement is here to stay and not just the product of a calm afternoon, a lucky streak, or a helpful breeze? Second, the physical therapist helping a stroke patient relearn to walk without support. The patient does beautifully in the clinic, but the clinic is a controlled, supportive, familiar place. What you really care about is whether they can walk safely at home in the messy real world, next week and next month. Both of these practitioners face the exact same underlying challenge. The thing they care about, learning, is invisible. All they can see is performance, here and now, which may or may not reflect what was truly durably learned. That gap between what we can see and what we want to know is the assessment problem, and the rest of the chapter is essentially a toolkit for bridging it. So let's draw the crucial distinction precisely, because everything depends on getting these 2 terms straight. Look at the left card, performance. Performance is simply observable behavior, the act of executing a skill at a specific time and in a specific place. When you watch someone serve a tennis ball right now, you are watching a performance. And notice 2 things about it. It's observable, you can see it, and it's temporary. It's just this one moment. Now, the right card, learning. Learning is a relatively permanent change in a person's capability to perform a skill, brought about by practice or experience. And here's the key word, capability. Learning increases your potential. Notice what you cannot do with learning. You cannot see it. It's not a behavior, it's an internal change. So we are always stuck inferring learning from performance, which is the visible part. Hold on to that contrast, observable and temporary versus inferred and relatively permanent,
because it's the backbone of this whole chapter.
I want to slow down on this idea that learning must be inferred, because it's genuinely important and a little philosophical. The truth is, we infer invisible internal states from visible behavior all the time, every single day. Someone smiles, and we infer they're happy. Someone cries, and we infer sadness, or maybe overwhelming joy. Someone yawns, and we assume they're tired. But here's the catch, and it's right there in the example. That classmate yawning beside you in lecture might not be sleep-deprived at all. They might just be bored out of their mind. The behavior is real and observable, but our inference from it can be wrong. Learning works in exactly this way. We observe performance, the behavior, and from it we deduce something about an internal capability we cannot see. And just like reading a yawn, our inference about learning can be mistaken if we're looking at the wrong evidence or looking under the wrong conditions. That vulnerability to error is precisely why we need careful, well-designed assessment methods rather than just casual observation.
Let's lay performance and learning side by side so the contrast is crystal clear, because I'll hold you to these distinctions all semester. Read the table with me, row by row. Visibility. Performance is observable behavior, something you can directly watch. Learning is inferred from that performance, deduced rather than seen. Duration. Performance is temporary, an in-the-moment thing. Learning is relatively permanent, meant to last. Cause. Performance may or may not be due to practice. You can perform well by luck on any given attempt. Learning, by definition, is the result of practice or experience. And the last row is the subtle one, but maybe the most important. Performance can be influenced by performance variables, those temporary factors we're about to discuss, whereas true learning is not influenced by them. If you internalize this one table, you'll already think more clearly about assessment than most people do. The whole game is recognizing that what you see, performance, is an imperfect, fluctuating window onto what you actually care about, learning. Now let's name the troublemakers directly. That last row of the table mentioned performance variables, and they deserve their own slide because they're the reason performance can lie to you. A performance variable is any factor that affects how someone performs without changing how much they've actually learned. Read the definition on the callout carefully. It touches performance, but not learning. The left card lists common ones: alertness, the anxiety of the situation, the unfamiliarity of the setting, fatigue, and so on. None of these change a person's underlying capability. They just temporarily inflate or depress what you observe. The right card spells out why you should care. A genuinely skilled learner who shows up exhausted will look worse than they really are. And flip it around. An easy, heavily supported practice setup, lots of feedback, lots of cues, can make someone look far better than they truly are on their own. Either way, the performance you observe misrepresents the learning underneath. So a huge part of good assessment is arranging conditions that let these variables fade, so you can see what was really learned. Keep that idea handy, because it comes roaring back in Part 3.
Let's recap Part 1 quickly before we move on. 3 things to take with you. First, the core distinction. Performance is observable behavior, while learning is an inferred, relatively permanent change in a person's capability. Second, the consequence of that distinction. Because learning itself is invisible, we are always reading it indirectly from performance, exactly the way we read someone's mood from a smile or a yawn, and exactly as fallibly. And third, the complication. Performance variables, things like fatigue, anxiety, and the novelty of a setting, can make performance overstate or understate the real learning that's there. So when you watch someone perform, stay humble about what you're actually seeing. With that foundation in place, we can now ask the natural next question. If learning is hidden, what are the visible signs that tell us it's happening? That's Part 2.